welcome to the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy's July installment of Little Nuggets of Tech and Telecom. Hello, Jen.
Hello, Carolyn from Vermont.
Yes, in Vermont, the floods have receded and no interruption to the horse show. So it's very exciting. A little warm up here. Cleet Johnson, we are so excited to have you join us this month. Thank you so much for making the time. How are you?
I'm so glad to be with you, and thank you so much for looping me in.
Absolutely. So for those of our audience who may not be entirely familiar with our topic, I just wanted to preview. So we are hosting Cleet Johnson from CSIS. He'll share a few details about his background. You guys have done some amazing research recently and have been publishing some reports on a really, really important topic that's been certainly part of the dialogue inside the Beltway, and that is there a relationship between a robust mobile digital infrastructure here in the US and the country's national security? And so I wanted to introduce you to everyone out there. And Cleet, if you could, I think you can best describe the path that has taken you through some very interesting career developments to join us today. So if you could offer just a few background points on your work and a little bit about CSIS, we can go ahead and start talking about the research you've been doing.
That would be great. Well, before my entire career has been spent in the security arena. And I came to Telecom relatively recently, in the last 10 years or so. But before that, my only connection with the telecom sector was that my granddad was a career surveyor for AT&T and laid coaxial cables all throughout the Southeast for AT&T.
Oh, wow.
And it was pretty cool. I just have memories of him with his hard hat and the call before you dig, appellation on his hats. But I worked I was a supply chain officer in the U.S. Army. When I got in the policy arena, I was at the Senate Intelligence Committee, and they're focused on like the intersection of business and security. So things like terrorist finance, counterproliferation, and cybersecurity. And so cybersecurity is what brought me into the telecom arena. And I went to the FCC so about 10 years ago in 2014, to become the chief counsel for cybersecurity at the Federal Communications Commission, and then went from there to the Commerce Department to serve as Secretary Penny Pritzker's advisor in cyber and tech. So the past 6 years or so, I've been at Wilkinson Barker Knauer working on a host of telecom security issues, from supply chain to 5G security to now spectrum. And I'm certainly not a technical spectrum expert, but my focus on security in really the past year or so, I'll tell a little bit more about the CSIS project, but I have just become astounded at and terrified about where we, the United States, where we are with regard to the spectrum. In the 60s, we had the missile gap. We have a spectrum gap now, where China is really is so far ahead of us in terms of allocating licensed commercial spectrum for 5G use, and not ahead of us on 5G. We remain for now ahead in advancing the 5G economy, but we are severely behind in allocating in the spectrum pipeline for more mid-band spectrum for licensed 5G. So I'll stop there and we can talk about the CSIS project, but
yes, thank you. I wanted to take a step back, and before we jump into the two really good reports in a podcast that you've already put out, I just wanted to take a step back for the audience and just give folks a little bit of context. We're reading in the news now, certainly China has been doing a tremendous amount of investment in upgrading their military. which some has seen as a direct challenge to the U.S. Position as having the most robust and strongest military in the world. But then we've also been seeing lately discussion in the press about the state of China's economy, which apparently is potentially not as strong and growing as fast as folks were thinking it would. So I wanted to ask you, against that backdrop, what do you perceive, putting aside 5G, but what do you perceive to be one of the key challenges to our national security? Is it in fact China trying to out-innovate us and take the lead on the global stage to be the leader on innovative technologies and a growth economy, or is there something else going on?
I think that is, I think it is China's intent to dominate the 21st century technology environment and thereby dominate, I don't want to sound too apocalyptic, but I do think it is as serious as this, to dominate the 21st century by dominating the technology environment. And that's where, I mean, 5G is a big part of that. It's much more than 5G, but the reason 5G is so central to it is that the ubiquitous connectivity. It's not just, as your viewers likely know, 5G is not just about a better cell phone.
Right.
It's about ubiquitous connectivity through the Internet of Things and sensors and connected vehicles, connected warehouses, connected logistics, connected, precision agriculture that has to do with, everything from soil samples to, autonomous tractors. We're entering an environment where everything in life will be connected, and therefore we'll be collecting data, and there will be more digital data, exponentially more, orders of magnitude more than has ever existed in human history. It will be a totally new era, and in the hands of an autocratic Chinese Communist Party. I want to make clear, this is not about Chinese people or China as a society. It's about the governance structure of the Chinese Communist Party, which affirmatively wants to control everything and almost like to make Big Brother or kind of a police state approach to society the norm. Social control, control of expression, control of even information. More data you have, the more AI and information operations you can run, and then on the military side, the more cyber operations and quantum computing.
Right.
So this is about market democracy versus authoritarian autocratic control. I genuinely believe that this is an existential issue for the United States. I don't say that lightly. There are very few true existential issues, but can we and our allies survive as market democracies if China dominates 21st century technology,
Right.
and therefore thereby dominates the information environment and basically controls what people do and say and even think based on controlling the information environment.
So walk us through a little bit, like I had mentioned that you guys have announced a series of analysis and research to really look at the crux of this. I know CSIS was very engaged on the topic of spectrum, maybe 10, 11, 12 years ago. Now I see that you guys are very much center stage now thinking about these issues. Can you maybe share with the audience who might not have had a chance to read your research, walk us through kind of high level, what are the considerations you looked at, and where did you land? What's your analysis leading you to in terms of a conclusion?
Absolutely. And I'll just say that this is Jim Lewis, who has long led the Strategic Technologies program at CSIS. He's something of a mentor to me in all things technology and security, from cybersecurity 15 years ago to now. Jim's been involved in spectrum issues and a whole host of these pertinent issues for a long time, including, as you mentioned, back in the 2000s, running a formal commission on spectrum that led to the CSMAC, which is the Advisory Committee on Spectrum, another terrible DC acronym, but the CSMAC. Also, the National Spectrum Strategy arose out of this commission that Jim led back in the early Bush administration. So, and the whole purpose was the same thing we're focused on now. How do we maximize commercial spectrum? Where we are right now is back in January we did a paper that was released in an event that Chairwoman Rosenworcel from the FCC keynoted, where we dug into this autocracy versus market democracy question. How does 5G play into the big battle of the 21st century? With that kind of as a very high level foundation, over the past few months, we've done a paper series and an event series digging into spectrum allocation and spectrum availability and how that plays into specifically the US-China security dynamic. You often hear, too often the spectrum debates are this zero-sum game that's effectively the federal government and especially DoD against the wireless industry. And it's like kind of like trench warfare. Each side wants their spectrum, the other side wants the other side's spectrum, and it's just this, it's an unproductive trench warfare.
Typical DC, right? You can't have a conversation unless somebody's the bad actor, right?
Yeah, totally. And spectrum is, for your viewers, that just to make spectrum concrete, it's invisible radio waves that go through the air and other matter here on Earth, and but they are effectively the indispensable natural resource that allows for wireless connectivity. And so you can't have the modern world without radio frequency spectrum. And that's the way to look at it. It's a natural resource. It's a finite resource. It's physics. There are only so many different frequencies that radio waves can travel, and that's the radio frequency spectrum. And so it's easy to see it as a zero-sum game. It's just like land. There's only so much of it. But what we're trying to do is use this paper series to open up the possibilities for more efficient use, for more precise coexistence, as they put it, between federal users and commercial users. There are a whole host of possibilities, but we're really trying to get beyond the trench warfare, the zero-sum game. And so we have three papers, 3 events. We have Jim did a paper a few weeks ago that kind of unpacked the security considerations in spectrum and describing like why China cares about spectrum so much, and how spectrum usage and 5G deployment is tied to standards, and therefore to supply chain, and therefore to trusted networks. And then day before yesterday, on Monday, I released a paper that made that a little bit more specific about the US-China dynamics, where China is, where the US is with regard to spectrum allocation, and why the spectrum shortage, or the gap that the United States faces vis-a-vis China, is so dangerous as a security issue. And what we can do about it. And the short answer is we need to reallocate more federal spectrum for commercial use.
See, if I could just interrupt there, sorry.
Sure.
The FCC has lost their spectrum authority temporarily. I think it went on hold in March. Is that right? It expired. The Wall Street really hasn't focused on that as much, but if I listen to what you said in this first part of the webcast, that's very concerning, right? I mean, I read the piece that Carolyn sent out that China in 5 years will have over 1,100 megahertz of mid-band spectrum versus, I don't know what the US, but is it about 300 or so, 350?
Yeah.
How do you see that kind of getting fixed, for lack of a better word?
I mean, it's an urgent hair on fire crisis for the United States, and it's really dangerous. This is for the viewers. The FCC has usually for the past 30 years has had authority to auction off federal spectrum, and it's a really innovative approach to spectrum allocation that actually won the developers of this, the economists who came up with this auction model, won the Nobel Prize in economics for this idea. And since the early 1990s, the FCC has had authority to do this. It's brought in hundreds of billions of dollars to the federal treasury. The idea is that if you put up spectrum to bid, you let the market decide how much it's worth, and it's worth a lot. And then it kind of forces a very efficient use of that spectrum because it's expensive. And if you invest in it, if one of the wireless carriers spends billions and billions of dollars to buy the spectrum, they're going to make good use of it. That authority lapsed in March, and it's like one of these things that used to always, this is just something you could count on, is that the FCC would have spectrum authority. Maybe the only thing left is that, and hopefully this will happen again this summer, but Congress will always does the Defense Authorization Act. They always authorize the Pentagon's activities. Hopefully that will continue this year. That used to be the case for spectrum authority, just something we have to have for the last 30 years. And it lapsed in March, and now it's becoming kind of a political game between, it's not a partisan issue. It's more of kind of an agency, the turf war is kind of gone into the House and the Senate.
And I think we've seen that a little bit, Jen and Cleet, with respect to what we just saw happen on C-band between the FAA and the FCC, right? So, these are agencies that, the processes and ability of different agencies who touch spectrum have really broken down over the last many years, not to suggest that the failure to renew auction authority is necessarily an example of that, but it is part of the overall dysfunction that has been created around an issue, as you said, Clay, really was a nonpartisan issue for many, many years. Republicans and Democrats saw the value. It was interesting. I just wanted to comment on your point that the idea that putting up spectrum for auction was something that I actually worked on as a little intern up on the Hill.
Really?
And it was informed by the way in which the federal government was able to dispense with all of that property back in the day under the RTC. And they found that doing auctions was the best way to go ahead and reallocate an asset most efficiently. But when it comes to spectrum auctions, as you said, companies show up, assuming they're legally, technically, and otherwise qualified, get the chance to spend their money and buy the auction and buy the spectrum. Interestingly, though, if you look at auctions for, I'll call them spectrum licenses, but not the way we are talking about licenses, where it has not been for full power commercial, it has been for low power, that spectrum has sold at a much lower price point. And interestingly enough, recently we saw the CFO of a cable company, which had purchased some of the spectrum, for example, the CBRS spectrum, indicating that they were in no hurry to build it out, which I think confirms your point. The more money you pay for the asset, the higher the obligation and the pressure on you to go ahead and invest in the infrastructure to make use of it, versus when you have spectrum auction with a bunch of restrictions on how and where you can use the spectrum, goes for a lot lower price point. And then we see that spectrum lying fallow. So again, not related to what we were just talking about vis-a-vis China and national security, but I did think it was an interesting reaction to the point you said in terms of usually when you buy spectrum for a lot of money, you want to build it out to get a return on that. So Jen, as you were saying, I'm curious, you said Wall Street has not focused so much on the fact that the FCC's auction authority has lapsed. But do you think that's going to change, especially given the fact that T-Mobile, who is not able to get its licenses actually awarded to it? So it did participate in an auction, but the FCC has decided, based on their review of the law, that it does not have the authority to act on those licenses and actually grant them to T-Mobile until its auction authority is restored. Does Wall Street care about that sort of thing?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, and I don't think that's the right thing, but they look at the chart where T-Mobile, even without the recent auction 108, have the most spectrum of all the big three. And so they think they're fine. And I think in some ways, in a very backward view, Clete, versus what you're saying, I think Wall Street looks at the $45 billion spectrum bill that Verizon paid for C-band alone, AT&T, $21 billion. Another 10 billion and 345. It's like almost a liability that they have to work through. But what I hear you say is they need more of it, and they need more of it fast.
And the reason is because it takes a long time to plan for the deployment.
Right.
So there, as again, I'm not a spectrum engineer, but the large carriers who are deploying, as Carolyn was saying, the wide area coverage, the so-called full power license spectrum. But what that basically means in layman's terms is the ability to cover wide areas. You think about the maps that you see of cell phone coverage. That license wide area coverage is effectively the primary arteries of the 5G ecosystem. And the 5G ecosystem will over time, and does now, include a mix and a balance of licensed and unlicensed. The reason we're focusing on licensed is because, number one, those are the primary arteries. Think of I don't want to take that artery metaphor too far, but those are the primary big arteries of the connectivity that makes up 5G. And that's where the United States is behind China. We're not behind, and I don't have the numbers with me here, but we're in some ways leading the world on on the unlicensed side. But we're behind on license application severely. And the reason that's a problem is not immediately in the next year or two, where the carriers that have this spectrum that they've just purchased in the C-band, for instance, they will be deploying in that spectrum over the next, I don't know if exactly the next 2 to 3 years. But the challenge is there's no pipeline for spectrum after that.
Right.
And so the pipeline runs dry, and that's the metaphor that really is scary, because the pipeline for mid-band is not going to run dry for China. Unlike us, and this is one, we certainly don't want to have the China model, but China is an authoritarian government that can just, without regard to consumer or commercial rights, that government can just say, we're going to do spectrum here, here, and here, and we're not going to fight about it. Here we have, in the United States, we have a much more complex system, many more stakeholders, many more agencies in the federal government. So it's harder for us to take these steps. I mean, I think our system is better, but it is harder to get out of the trench warfare that we see.
To your point on how long it takes, what was it? AWS was 12 to 13 years from the point of deciding that can, that would work, to the process of identifying, to moving, to upgrading the equipment. And I think also, to your point, this not being a zero-sum game, I think Pentagon, the Department of Commerce, many other federal agencies who have an interest in spectrum for one reason or another, recognize that this is a topic that we all have to link arms on and move forward. This is not just about spectrum in the 3 gigahertz band or 4, 7 or whatnot. This is going to be a continuous challenge to all of us. And I think one of the things I took away from your research and the analysis was, we need to really move away from this sense of zero sum. That is not what is going to be the workable solution. It's an all of the above approach. But please, I know we only have a few minutes left. If you could give us kind of your high level takeaways from the research in terms of what you think could be positive steps with the administration, Congress, NTI, FCC, industry. What can we be doing right now to, number one, get that pipeline identified and filled, and number two, create a good, trusting, working relationship with all of the stakeholders, including DoD, which has a very, very important role and absolutely needs spectrum for their core missions. We recognize that. How do we make sure everybody gets what they need?
Yeah, no, I think that's, there are a couple of things that are low hanging fruit. One is Congress has to reauthorize Spectrum Authority. That's the be all and end all, indispensable first step. Second, we need to have coherent, you mentioned the C-band and the FAA. We need to have coherent government processes that, let the interagency haggle and fight things out and then make a decision, and then the government and industry can move based on that decision. We're not relitigating decisions that have previously been made. So
Right.
a lot of that will require White House leadership. The third thing, this is where we'll focus a lot of our recommendations, is the practical steps to change the frame from the zero sum approach to affirmatively maximizing spectrum capabilities.
Right.
If the frame is, and a lot of this is intangible, but there are some tangible steps we can take to make sure that agencies and industry both and all see spectrum as a natural resource that we can maximize,
Right.
as opposed to a natural resource that we should hoard. And that's that's a lot easier said than done.
Right.
Nice words, but I think there are some practical things that we're gonna look into. There have been tremendous technical advances in the past 10 years. I think I saw a statistic that in the commercial wireless world, the spectral efficiency, meaning the ability to leverage a certain band of spectrum for for data processing or connectivity, is 42 times more efficient than it was, I think, just 10 years ago. 42 times. That's not a marginal increase. So if we can take those spectral efficiency advances and proliferate those advances through other programs, including longer term government procurement system. Not as easy, you can't retrofit an F-16
Right.
easily, but can we take some of those advances, even if it's not 42 times more efficiency? You basically create more of the natural resource by creating efficiency gains. Likewise, there's so much more precision on so-called static sharing, geographic sharing.
Yep.
It used to be that the systems were not precise enough, and you had to have if you were going to share a spectrum band geographically, you had to have these big buffer zones.
Yeah, like you can use it on the East Coast, but nowhere else in the country.
Yeah, exactly. Now we have the technology exists to make sharing, geographic sharing, much more precise. So you can eke out a lot more of the spectrum for both users. So we're going to provide some input on that. But I think the most important point in all of this, and it's an overarching point, but it's also very specific to that last set of points about these advances, and that is that commercial strength and innovation. And this is coming from a very proud Army veteran. Commercial strength and vitality and innovation is national security. And it's not one versus the other. It's not DoD focuses on national security, the wireless industry focuses on economic growth. They're not bifurcated. Commercial strength and vitality is at the heart of national security. It always has been. We won World War II because of our industrial capability. We
Right.
won the Cold War because of our economic vitality.
Mhm.
That is even more true now. And this is a lot of these advances that are going to allow us to maximize spectrum for all users will come from commercial innovation. And we have to find ways to feed those advances back into this, in some cases, necessarily slower moving processes of federal systems. So we think there's a chance for a win-win here. I'm not naive to think that we can turn these. It'll be easy to turn these happy words about, we need to move away from zero sum, but it is, we have to, because if we don't, China will dominate the 21st century and we won't be a market democracy anymore. So I think we got to do it.
You're echoing someone from Jen's background, which is Jamie Dimon. Jen, you may have seen this. He was doing an interview and he made what is, I think, an obvious point, but one that we need to be reminded of, which is exactly what you just said, Cleet. A strong economy equals a strong national defense. He pointed out that Americans don't appreciate how good we have it. Peaceful neighbors above, peaceful neighbors below, buffers called the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and a very, very robust economy that enables a robust military. And so thank you very much for helping us connect those dots. Jen, any last thoughts or questions for Cleet before we pull this
No,
together?
that was great, Cleet. I wish we could, bridge DC and Wall Street to make that point. So I think there'd be a lot of wide eyes open listening to you. So really appreciate the time and of course the color and perspective.
Thank you all so much. I'm really glad to chat with you. This has been great.
And we look forward to the third piece. We will go ahead and send a link around to the first two pieces that we've discussed here,
Okay, great.
as well as the podcast. And then I believe you have an event coming up on the 25th, which
On
is
the
next
25th, and the details are still coming into focus. I think I can confidently say that we will have remarks from Chairwoman Rosenworcel, and then more details to follow.
Fantastic.
But it will aim at what do we do now? If we
Right.
find the problem, how do we, what concrete steps can we, our society, not just the government, but the government and industry, what do we do now?
Wonderful. Thank you again.
Okay,
And
thank you.
all of our audience members, Jen and I are going to take, we're not taking the month off. We'll be working. But we are not going to do a little nugget of tech and telecom for August, which I know is making all of you very sad. However, we will be back in September, and I think we're going to have a great speaker, I think from your world, Jen, to talk about fourth quarter and what it looks like for the tech and telecom sector. So
Exactly. September to remember. We'll make it a speaker worth turning in. Great.
Love it.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the summer, and thank you again, Cleet.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you again.
all so much.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Jen, take care. Have a
Bye.
good one, everyone.